Welcome back to StoryTube, everybody. This is a video that I've been thinking about filming for a while now, and I wasn't sure if I actually wanted to do it or not, but I've been thinking about the book, and I keep thinking about the book, so fuck it, here we are. Today, we're going to talk about The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker. I'm going to put it up here so I don't get accused of waving it around too much. So the reason that I've been conflicted about whether I want to make this video and talk about this book is that I have some conflicting thoughts and feelings about it, and that always makes reviewing or discussing a book a little bit harder because I want to do it justice. I want to get across what I want to say, and I obviously don't want to get stones figuratively thrown at me. And I wasn't sure if I am smart enough to put my thoughts into words and brave enough to put those words onto the internet. But here we are. So The Darkness That Comes Before. What is this book about? I had heard a lot about it before going into it, but didn't really know anything about the plot. I had heard that it is the grimmest of grimdarks, that it's dense, that it's philosophical, that it's violent, that it's strange, that it's out there, and that it's essentially unlike anything else that exists in the fantasy genre. This is the first book in the Prince of Nothing trilogy, which is a part of the Second Apocalypse series, which consists of that first trilogy and then a quartet. I always get that wrong, but it's 7 books in total, and essentially this sets up the beginning of a holy war. So about 2,000 years ago in this world, I think if I remember correctly, there was an apocalyptic event, an apocalypse, and there's some kind of prophecy, mythology that there will be a second apocalypse, but not everybody believes in it. And now there are political forces at play, all trying to use this pretext of a holy war for their own purposes. So this does feel very much like an opening chapter to a longer story. I think it's very difficult to talk about theme or intent, and we'll get back to that later, about this book only because it is very much an opening chapter. I don't think this is a first book that has like a beginning, middle, end and its own little story, really. I mean, it does, but you wouldn't be able to read this in isolation, is what I'm trying to say. And it sets up a very complex world and cast of characters that will pay off in following books once you're already familiar with them. Which brings me to the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's the fact that everybody talks about this series as being extremely complex and kind of difficult to grasp and get into, and that it takes some work. And that's definitely true. I was worried that it was going to be even more dense than it is. I think I was very prepared for that aspect of it, and I was surprised by how immediately engaging I found it. This has some kind of old school storytelling vibe to it, and I don't necessarily mean this in an old school fantasy kind of way. It's certainly not in a cozy way at all, but from the first prologue, this is 2 prologues, I got this distinct feeling of sitting around a campfire and somebody telling me a story. It has this feeling of myth, and maybe that's the part of me that grew up with the Brothers Grimm stories and very early on found out a lot of the original versions of those fairy tales and a lot of other German fairy tales that children grow up with that are not wholesome and not cozy at all. And maybe that's what this is tapping into. But I got this sense of this is myth, this is lore. Somebody would sit down and tell me this tale. And I really love that. It's one of the reasons that I love fantasy, because fantasy often has that quality to it of old school storytelling. And I think this world really lends itself to that. And it's probably just because of this apocalypse mythos that I was really into. Just the phrase second apocalypse, I think, is so contradicting that I just love it. I think that's an instant hook for me to want to know more about what that means. So in terms of it being philosophical or dense or difficult to read, I didn't actually find that at all. In terms of the writing style, I found it really easy to read. It was a extremely immersive, extremely quickly immersive, and just engaging flow to the writing. But that doesn't mean that it was an easy read, for several reasons. But one of them being that he throws an insane amount of terminology at you. And he does not hold your hand. I think, if anything, he's swatting your hand away if you're trying to reach out. And a lot of this comes from the fact that he mentions something once, and then he mentions like 5 terms of fantasy lingo within one sentence, and then never repeats the explanation again, and you need to figure out what they mean. And he has multiple different ways of referring to essentially the same thing, which makes it extra confusing. And a couple of times I had to reach out to other people that I know have read it and ask questions, because I just couldn't find what I was looking for, and I was getting a little bit lost, and some of the early political machinations that are going on were definitely going over my head, because I just wasn't sure who all of these groups of people were. So definitely a lot going on there. Some pages I had to go and reread once like it clicked halfway through the conversation. I had to go back to the beginning and like, oh, now I'm going to read it actually understanding what they're talking about in the first place. So definitely tricky in that sense, like dense in terms of the amount of information that you're expected to grasp and work with and just understand in order to understand where the story's going. But other than that, I was surprised by how engaging I found it. I really was not sure if I was going to like this book going into it, which I think helped with my expectations and to temper it. I hoped I was going to like it, but I felt that there was a possibility that I would hate it, just because of how people talk about it, and I was worried that I would find it pretentious. And I did not, which was a very pleasant surprise. There's also a sprawling cast of characters, a lot of POVs. There's no like POV chapters. POVs change within the same chapter, but he does kind of keep them to one plot thread, I suppose, which in each part, which was kind of helpful. I like when authors do that, because it really gets you into this one storyline and immerses you in it without like context switching all the time. So that was cool. And I enjoyed reading about most of these characters. And now enjoyed is a tricky word to use when speaking about anything relating to the darkness that comes before. And that gets me to the darkness of it all, and the grimdark of it all, and the violence, and all those unpleasant things that I was told to expect, and I fully did. And they're certainly there. They're certainly there. If somebody tells you that this book is not for the faint of heart, that is absolutely true. If you don't like violence, this is certainly not the series for you. This is certainly a world filled with selfish people that are trying to get by in a really fucked up environment, and bad things happen to them, and I'm sure bad things will continue to happen to them, because like I said, this does very much feel like a prologue to a much longer story. But you might be wondering, if I didn't find it too dense and I found it really engaging and I was prepared for the violence, why did I say that I had conflicting feelings about this book? Yes, bad things happen to everybody, and it is a dark world for everybody, but there is a specific focus on bad things happening to women and on violence being inflicted on women. And this is not something that I was unprepared for, because I've heard and read reviews, and it's not something that always necessarily bothers me. I've read a lot of fantasy and non-fantasy that has plenty of violence against women for a variety of reasons, often some kind of variation of historical accuracy. So that in itself is not necessarily an issue. There are only 2 female POVs, and I haven't counted the total, but there are a lot more male POVs. Again, not uncommon and not by itself an issue. However, there were a couple of things that were an issue and that about halfway through the book started really bothering me. Well, they started irking me, and then as I got through the second half of the book, they gradually began to really bother me. And it was, on the one side, the repetitiveness of the violence that left me wondering what it was trying to say, what this story was trying to tell me. Was it trying to tell me that in a horrible world, everybody becomes horrible? Or was it just trying to tell me that this kind of violence is the only worst thing that can possibly happen to specifically female characters? The other side of things, and this was my main problem, was the way this violence was depicted. Specifically, actually, when we were in the female characters' POV and how they would react to their surroundings and to the world, and how they respond to trauma, which I didn't find varied at all. I didn't find it nuanced or realistic, to be honest, since I mentioned historical accuracy earlier. And it made the whole thing feel extremely voyeuristic and, for lack of a better word, just kind of icky. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that the issue is not necessarily the presence of violence against women. The issue is not that we are being shown a world that is grim and that is very, very misogynistic. The issue is not that there are more male POVs with more agency than the female characters, although I don't love that, but I understand the necessity of that, or what that is trying to say with the world that we're being presented with. My issue is how the female characters that we do have are handled, how they are written, how they react to what happens to them, and the fact that everything that happens to the 2 main female characters and everything that they do revolves around men in every way. And I just don't believe that that would be the case, even in a world as deeply patriarchal as this one. It also just got to a point where that violence was losing its effect. Not because I was growing numb to it, because then you could still make an argument that the text is making a point, right? That we do become numb towards suffering and trauma if it's happening over and over and over and over again to other people, or we're reading about it. But just in the sense that I started rolling my eyes, because the moment a female character would show up, 1 page later, she's being assaulted, you know? So it became kind of laughable to me. This is the interesting thing though. If I had read this book in a vacuum, without anybody to talk to about it, if I had just picked this up randomly 5 years ago, 10 years ago, before being on BookTube, before really using Goodreads, and I had just read it by myself and then put it on a shelf and never talked about it again, I maybe would have even DNF'd it. I don't think so. Maybe. I probably would have ended up hating it and giving it like 2 stars, because this aspect of it completely took over and overshadowed all of the good stuff that I talked about earlier in this video and that I absolutely loved. However, I did not read this book in a vacuum. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and it's an interesting conversation to have, I think, not specifically about this book, but in general, about how we feel about things based on the environment that we're in. But anyway, I read this book because it was recommended. I read this book because people that I trust and whose opinions I value love this series. So I talked to those people while I was reading the book and while I was halfway through when things were starting to irk me and I was feeling a certain way about it. And those are very interesting conversations to have. And there were two main, I think, outcomes of those conversations. One being that Bakker has spoken about his intent writing this story, and especially the first book or the first trilogy, in the way that he writes it. In that he does have a very cynical outlook, I think, on humanity, and that definitely shines through. I do not share that cynical outlook. I think that certainly plays into it as well. But that he's also trying to make a commentary on literature or the fantasy genre specifically, and about how it treats women and about the male gaze in media. That's very interesting, and I mean, that certainly comes across that he is heightening what we would call the male gaze, and that he is trying to make people uncomfortable with it. The other side of things, and this is what really made me stick with it and what makes me hold on my opinion about this first book, is that things change and the way he writes women progresses and the world changes. I don't know more, I don't know any spoilers, but this makes me want to stick with it because I think that what the point that this book is trying to make might become clear when reading the entire series. Because when looking at this book in isolation, I don't think Bakker succeeds at making it clear that he's trying to make a point or trying to comment on something. To me, reading it, it just felt like he's doing it. Like he is perpetrating the male gaze, not like he's trying to comment on it. That might change with the whole story, looking at the finished product. So this is a book that I can't really rate or comment on in terms of what I truly fully think about it until I have a whole series and perspective, and then can look back on it and see, okay, was this a good start to this arc, to this theme, to what he was trying to say, or was it not? In isolation, it remains kind of a frustrating experience, but also a really, really interesting one, in that it is in many ways an incredible, fascinating, engaging start to a really exciting story that I loved and want more of and crave more of, but also felt misogynistic in its extreme. And I want to be really, really clear that I'm not calling Bakker misogynistic. But reading this book, like I said, imagining reading it in isolation and looking at it without any context and looking only at the text, that was my experience. Before I wrap this video up, I also want to shout out Bookborn because she did a video about violence against women in fantasy and the whole historical accuracy argument of it all that I have been thinking kind of nonstop ever since reading this book and thinking about this book. And it's a very well-researched video, so you should definitely go check that out if you haven't. I'll link it in the description. So, The Darkness That Comes Before. A very interesting reading experience overall. Very different from any other reading experience as a whole that I've had, definitely this year. I will definitely be continuing with the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I honestly think I'm at this point I'm committing to at least 4 books, which would be the Prince of Nothing trilogy and the first in the sequel quartet, which is the Aspect Emperor. So I'm committing to at least those. If it's not working for me after 4 books, I'll stop. But I don't really think that's going to be the case, to be honest, because enough of it was working really, really well. And like I said, I've talked to people that I really trust, and I feel like it's going to be for me. Let me know, have you read The Darkness That Comes Before? What was your experience like? I would totally understand if somebody told me I absolutely hated that book, I never want to go near it ever again. I get it. I totally get it. I don't think you're wrong. But if somebody told me they love it and it's one of their favorite series of all time, I get that too. And I don't know where I'm going to fall by the end of it, which, love that. That's an interesting and enriching reading experience, isn't it? We don't always want to just think something is terrible or love it above everything else. Everything in the middle adds value as well, and especially when it's something that just doesn't let you sleep at night because you keep thinking about it and talking about it. So here we are. I am going to let you go because I am talking in circles at this point. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the book or if you're interested in it. Don't come at me with your dude bro energy. Like the video if you liked it, consider subscribing, all that stuff, you know the drill. And thank you for watching. See you next time. How do we segue into what I want to say next? Conflicting.